Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to this lovely episode of Calling from the Wilderness, our Sermon on the Mount series. I'm assuming it's going to be lovely because all of them are. Uh, Joined with me today, we have Tim,
Hello.
who is over in England, and
Still there.
me, who is over here. And
In God's country.
we're Yeah. And for those that don't know how this started, we, during this pandemic, we started Facebook video chatting with each other, check in, and also share ideas on stuff, on sermons and things like that. And from those conversations, we wanted to invite other people into them and to give their input and their thoughts, because that's what's wonderful about the body of Christ is the
Mhm.
diversity of
Yeah.
experience. And so that we started doing this, and
Mhm.
so this is for you to come in and kind of see what our conversations were like, to join in, to have input.
Mhm.
This isn't meant to be, and I know a lot of these video blog YouTube things are meant to be a sermon that you were to pick up. We're talking at you. This is meant to be
Mhm.
more of a discussion where we're talking with you.
Yeah.
So feel free to comment, to put any ideas down. Not only just, hey, I loved it or I didn't, or you guys are heretical, um, but even, you know, I never thought about it this way. I've always grown up thinking this way. Or you know what?
Mhm.
I read something a while ago that changed my view on this. Or you
Mhm.
know that discussion led me on this way.
Yeah.
It happened to me on Sunday. Our sermon was about the Lord's Prayer and stuff, and all of a sudden that started getting me thinking about the Tower of Babel, and then Pentecost, and then
Mhm.
how we divide and then we build together,
Mhm.
and I guarantee you that is the way, not the way the preacher thought the sermon was going to go or what people were going to pick up out of the sermon. But that's how sometimes brains work. So even if it's not having to do with anything that we mention, um,
Mhm.
write it down, comment. And so this can be a community.
Yeah.
And yeah, I, I figured you'd agree with that, Tim.
I'm
Um,
all for it. All for it.
Yeah, so our process is we do 3 weeks on a topic with a guest in there. And then on the fourth week, we are going to just take different discussions or ideas we've had in the previous 3 weeks and go dive deeper with them. Or maybe we've learned something. Like the first week, we thought about this, and then we've had 2 weeks to think about it. And we're like, you know what? That
Mhm.
dipping your toe in the
Yeah.
water and doesn't really cover everything.
Mhm.
And so we are doing a Sermon on the Mount series right now. You can check out the Beatitudes and Salt and Light. They're also on this
Yeah.
page. Today we are looking at the law and Jesus and how it all fits together. So join us. We're going to read through it, take a moment of silence just to ponder, and then we're going
Mhm.
to read through it again. If anything jumps out, write it down. Anything that
Mhm.
any words that are interesting to you, jot them down, and if we don't cover them, then put them in the comments. And on that fourth week, when we're discussing the
Mhm.
previous three, we would love to mention them and
Yeah.
talk about them.
Mhm.
Here we go. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
Okay. First off, I would like to say I messed up and I never got Tim to introduce himself or to go through the questions with Tim like I think I was supposed to. So we are going to do that next week. That's a little teaser for you guys.
Come back and find out then.
Yeah, same bat time, same bat channel. Tim, was there any words or phrases that jumped out to you reading this?
Yeah, so there was two. There was the one where it says the nothing will pass from the law until all is accomplished. And then just thinking about that, in context of unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Those are kind of a couple of the things that were jumping out at me. How about yourself?
Um, well, this translation kind of threw me for a loop because with therefore whoever relaxes one of the least of these,
Mm,
and I've never read that in a version before. I
yeah, yeah.
read this passage in the NIV last night. So relax is
Hmm.
like, what does relax even mean? And how do you relax a law? Don't you just break it or not?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and also the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees got me
Yeah.
thinking about some stuff. So
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah. Um, okay. So those are some words and phrases. What questions have come out?
Yeah, I'm interested in this contrast with Jesus, who fulfills the law and the prophets, but that the law still has something to accomplish.
Mm,
That I haven't thought of it in that kind of contrast way before. And then the second thing, similar to what you were just saying, was the fact that looking at scribes and Pharisees were people who were very aggressive about the literal letter of the law, and yet somehow they're being in contrast, as you say, with the person who relaxes the commandments, and is somehow considered to be lesser. But then the person whose righteousness exceeds the people who are very aggressive about the law, apparently, yeah, will enter the kingdom of heaven. There's a whole I'm confusing myself even talking about it, and I just don't get it. I just don't get it. How
yeah.
about yourself?
Um, yeah, I would say what is, and I've talked about this, but I'm interested to learn more about it. Like, what is missing in the way the Pharisees have exercised the law, their ideas of the law,
Mm.
that they have not done everything that the law requires, kind of thing, right? Like, what's
Yeah.
missing? Is it just the love aspect or the relationship aspect? Like we grew up believing, or is there something more to that?
Mm.
Um, and then yeah, and I think like you said, the relax is bad, and if you teach it, it's bad. The
Yeah.
law is good, and the Pharisees do it, but if we've read anything from the Bible, Jesus butts heads with the Pharisees and scribes all the time.
Hmm.
So obviously they're
Mm-hmm.
not doing it properly either.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
closer than these. Like, I'm not sure what
Yeah.
how it goes, but let's get into it.
Excellent. All right, let me stop the share, start the clock. Where do you want to start?
Well, I want to start a little bit on the background of the Pharisees.
Okay.
Um, just in how like Israel was in exile in the Old Testament, and they believe that that was because they walked away from God and they weren't
Yeah.
following his ways and stuff. And so the Pharisees do not want that to happen again.
Yeah.
They want to keep Israel pure and holy, and the fact that Rome is over top of them
Hmm.
is an indication that Israel's not doing their part. And so
Hmm.
when the Pharisees are trying to
Yeah.
stay, like, we always have this bad idea of Pharisees, like, oh, they always
Oh
butted
yeah.
up against Jesus, but they just wanted to
Yeah.
keep Israel pure and
Hmm.
holy, so they didn't go back into exile.
Yeah.
And their idea of, I think a lot of us are more like Pharisees than Jesus in a lot of things. Well, like
Yeah.
the idea
Yeah.
of, keep everything away. You can't do that. This is what a Christian does. This is what a Christian
Yeah.
doesn't. This is black
Yeah.
and white.
Yeah.
And so we are a lot more trying to keep ourselves and our communities holy and
Yeah.
um, pure by
Yeah.
not letting other things come in and taint it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
And I heard it. I
tell
heard
me
it
if that
in.
sounds familiar in any of the churches you've been in, because I know it does for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so that, like, their intentions, the Pharisees' intentions, are good intentions,
Yes.
and they're doing what they believe to be right, but it's
Hmm.
not going all the way.
Yeah.
And even in our own lives, I think our intentions are good sometimes, and we do things, but we mess up and we
Yeah.
don't have
Yeah. Yeah.
everything together.
And I think like the way it was described by one of our professors in college, who I can't remember which one it was and what class it was, but was like saying like, if you imagine like, the pit of sin to be like the center point, and all the laws of God were like the immediate edge of that, right? So it's like, do not commit murder, do not commit adultery, kind of looking at the 10. And then so the Pharisees then come up with this secondary ring to help protect us from even getting close to that first ring, right? So they come up with, it's like, well, if murder's the problem, then we need to actually take what happens just before murder, and we need to protect people from crossing that line. And then they're like, oh, but that's even getting too close, maybe we need another line. And so the layers, it's almost like a reverse onion in that way, right? They start to add layers to it, so that you're so that at every step you're getting further and further away from that kind of falling into that center pit, which is what you were saying. Like, the intentions are that people don't fall into this pit of sin, which keeps us separated from God, which keeps, other, in this case, like nations in power over us. But then what happens is that each ring becomes the thing that you defend, because that's the line you don't want to cross. And so instead of defending like the center laws, the 10 commandments, what you start defending is all your interpretations of how that works. And
Mm,
as you say, that, that's where it seems to be that Jesus really butts heads with the Pharisees, and they're asking him questions about, like, who do you pay, who do you give money to, do you give it to God or do you give it to Caesar? Why do your disciples not wash their hands when they're doing this? And there's these layers of kind of, cultural laws, which they saw as being, but in many ways, when their cultural laws got broke, they saw that as breaking the law of God, as compared to the laws that they had done to protect them from breaking the law of God.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
So
I
you
think,
end up
yeah,
fighting for and separating yourself from people based on your preferences and
yes,
not
yes,
the
excellent.
gospel, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so even in church, I have a preference for this music, or I have a preference for this
yeah,
group, or I have a preference for this, and I have a preference for this, or
yeah,
the idea that you have to get yourself right and clean and
yeah,
sober and all this kind of stuff before you even enter the church is
yes, yeah,
a
yeah,
preference
yeah,
of how you want to be surrounded while you're worshiping,
yes, yeah,
and
yeah,
not the gospel.
yeah. And when you think about, like, dancing used to be, like something that you is just it was just an absolute no-no, right? Like,
Yeah.
or churches that would physically distance men and women from each other. It's like we saw this line being crossed of sexual immorality, right? And
Hmm.
and it's just like, so to be able to prevent that, let's basically create, two extremes by which we hold everybody to, and we
Yeah.
create all these rules to hold that difference. And what happens, obviously, is that the yeah, it just, as you say, it becomes about this kind of, your preference becomes the laws, and we lose track of even what we were even trying to accomplish often with them, and not recognizing then what that makes, as you say, like, so someone else comes from the outside and then says, well, I have to do all of these things before I can come through the door. And you're like, no, you don't have to, not recognizing that that's the exact message that we're putting out
The
by
subtext.
structuring. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. My one of my favorite things, well, not favorite things, but it reminds me of like when the Catholics, when they were head honchos, and they had all these
Mm,
images and artwork and all this stuff of God, and they were very, I mean, they spent a lot of indulgence money and stuff on art
mm,
and taxes and stuff. And then Protestants come, and they're like, nope, no art.
yeah,
That's the terrible thing. We're going to build
yeah,
altars and put the preacher
yeah,
up there because the word is higher than all
yeah, yeah.
this. And they just went straight 180 with it. And so
Mm,
there's that, that's a preference, right? That's
mm, mm,
may- maybe it's a middle ground. Yeah. So
mm,
so in going with that, what
yeah.
is the the thing that the Pharisees are missing? What is the, like, if they've got a hole in their can, and no, that's a
Mm,
terrible analogy. That comes from what we were talking earlier. They're, I was thinking that didn't work, but they're at the 90 yard line. And they've got that extra 10. Why can't they just punch it in? Why can't they finish it off?
mm, mm, mm.
Um, to me, okay, I'm gonna go, and
Yeah,
then
yeah,
you can tell me that I'm
yeah.
wrong.
Do it.
Uh,
You got the wrong can. You've got the wrong can. Yeah.
but it was that, like you said, the preferences and that shell around
Mm,
hell or whatever, uh, that was getting in the way of people's relationship with God, where the more
yes.
emphasis was put on the rules and regulations than they are
Yes.
the relationship. And I know that's a lot of
Yeah.
ours, and I know some of you have just maybe vomited in your mouth because you've been told that your whole life from some really weird places. But rules and regulations over relationship, right? Like
Mm,
you showed me this video years and years ago that I still use, where this gentleman, I can't remember his name, maybe you do, but he's talking about Jesus's holiness. Like we think of it as a white T-shirt or something that if someone
mm,
touches us, it gets dirty, or we
yeah,
got to stay out of crawl spaces or whatever because his holiness is going to get dirty. Where
mm,
Jesus's holiness is like bleach, where it isn't affected by his surroundings, but it affects the surroundings
yeah,
around
yeah,
it, right?
yeah, yeah,
If you if you
yeah,
sprayed bleach on a floor, you're not really worried what's going to happen to the bleach. It's more about what's happening to the floor,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
right? And I think
yeah,
that's the thing is their their idea of holiness and these keeping these rules were
mm,
preventing them from going to the places where people were
mm,
and helping people, and images of God were preventing
mm,
them from helping these people
mhm.
because of their idea of I don't want to get that dirt on me,
Yeah,
instead
yeah,
of the bleach where it's like, no, I can go and I can help these people, and
yeah,
my God's more powerful, that I'm not worried about what's going to happen to me and
mm,
my faith and my holiness. I'm more excited about what God's going to do in that situation when I go there
yeah,
in and through me.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So first to say is that was the Reverend Dr. Calvin Samuel, who's a Methodist
Yes.
minister here in I can't remember if he lives in London now, but definitely in the UK. And you're absolutely right, and I think that it so resonates with the way I understood like half of the job of Christians, if not more of half the job, was to protect God from sin, right? Like
Hmm.
we had this thing as if somehow the whole, as you say, the holiness of God could be tainted as compared to the holiness of God being the thing that transforms and changes the things that the holiness comes in contact with. And I think you're right, is like what we have in the beginning of scripture is this story of what we call the fall, where we focus ourselves on Adam and Eve being thrown out of the garden, which for us represents them being removed from the presence of God. And there is something to that. But what immediately follows when we have the first murder is we have, after Cain has killed Abel and God comes and talks to Cain, one of the punishments for Cain is that he will wander forever, out of the presence of God. And Cain says that punishment is more than I can bear. And so there's something about the way that actually what underpins its scripture right from the start, and what I think Jesus was trying to emphasize as well, is that what we see as being kind of that the kind of separation from God because of our sin, it is our relationship is somehow has a separation and a brokenness in it, but that doesn't mean that God is absent, and that doesn't mean that we can't, that God isn't reaching out to us and seeking through the work of God's Spirit and through the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. Not like there's stuff happening that have nothing to do with us being ready, being pure, being holy, and has everything to do with the fact that God continues to be committed and present and active in the world, transforming and redeeming the things that everybody else says is rubbish and needs to get thrown out. And I
Hmm.
think what you're saying is right. It's like they got to this point where we were like, where the Pharisees were trying to protect something of this holy God, of the holiness of the people, that actually then became the very thing that that stopped them from actually being in or recognizing that they were welcomed into that presence, that they were, and that in that space, then they were able to see the needs of other people and meet them. Like what Jesus gets criticized for seeing people healed on the Sabbath, and he's just like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And you can just imagine that they would be like, yeah, that's just, you're just doing some wordplay there. We've got it figured
Yeah.
out. You've just broken the law.
Yeah.
um but as you say, that underpins the fact that like we lose what we do when we take our preferences and make them law, or make them so structured, is that we lose our ability to meet with God, to meet with each other, and to be transformed by the continual work of the Spirit in our midst.
Absolutely. When you're thinking, and this isn't necessarily following the same road you were going,
Hmm.
but
Sorry.
I was thinking the law,
Hmm.
like I have always grown up thinking that the law was there,
Hmm.
and if you broke the law, it meant death. Like breaking the
Yeah,
law was leading to death, right?
yeah, yeah.
Well, what if we change it in saying that following the law leads to life?
Mm.
And so, if Jesus is here to fulfill the law, all these little steps, like following it, is getting you closer, and then
Mm.
the living it out the way Jesus did and loving the
Mm.
people and stuff is the fulfillment of it. Like it's just a little
Mm.
reversal where
Yeah.
instead of being so focused on the negative and breaking this, you're gonna,
Mm.
leads to death, and be
Yeah.
so critical of those that are not following that way that you are
Yeah.
doing,
Yeah. Yeah.
and worried about them because they're breaking it and they're gonna
Mhm.
stumble and all this kind of stuff. You just say, you know, here's here's law, here's the Ten Commandments, here's the kind of
Mm.
things. If you follow them, you're gonna experience
Mm.
life more.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
Instead of just focusing on the positives than the negatives, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And I think too, like recognizing what laws are for. Like
yeah,
we see laws as protecting our our individual rights, like it's like, oh, somebody has wronged me. I want justice, I want retribution, protect me. But actually laws are, I think in my understanding, laws are meant to help us to live in harmony in community, right? Like, so where everybody has the same rights, and when people are wronged, that there is some sense of what do we hold as a community to be justice for that wrong, and how do we hold that space together. And as you say, it's not about like, do you break it death, or do you keep it life, but actually that kind of focus on, or as you say, that the kind of the yeah, the kind of the pressure of, you've got to keep it because otherwise it's death. But actually recognizing that what it's there for, and I think which is what the Ten Commandments ultimately kind of teach us, is it's about how do we live in relationship with God? How do we live in relationship with ourselves? How do we live in relationship with our community and with our world? And how do we hold those principles as kind of central to, as you say, what drives us into living life more to the full? And like
shalom.
it's it. Yeah, 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 exactly,
Yeah,
and again, like that was, I think, partly what the Pharisees were trying to do was trying to get Israel to live in such a pure way, in such a holy way, that the Messiah was going to come in and usher in that kingdom of shalom, that kingdom of peace, that kingdom of, and they thought that the only way it was going to happen is if God saw them to be good enough to actually to come in. And instead, that kind of aspiration, again, aspiring for things that it's become so legalistic that either you become holier than other people, or become, as Martin Luther said, where it was part of like his kind of journey towards the Reformation, was about the way that he could no longer he could no longer kind of bear the weight of his guilt
mm,
of his sin, because the structure was meant to, or the structure was holding it in a way that was less about, it wasn't about like restoration in life. It was about, as you say, kind of guilt and death.
yeah,
And I think what you were saying at the beginning really resonates with me, and I feel like that's kind of rolling in my mind with all of this, is like that sense of like, are we drawing people into spaces that ultimately cause guilt and death, or are we creating open spaces of restoration and life,
Mm,
um, with each other and with our culture, with our communities, and ultimately the one who's doing it all with God.
yeah. Yeah, it just reminds me of a story, and I think I've told it on this podcast, was when I was in plumbing school and our friend took me out for a drink and he asked me like he knew I'd been to college or something. He was like, "What did you do in college?" And I said, "Oh, bachelor's of biblical studies." It's like, "Oh, so you're one of those Christians?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "So what can't you do?"
Mm,
And that was like the first question. And I think it is for many people when they
mm.
realize people are from the churches, we're known more for what we're against than what we're for,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And so the
Mm,
Pharisees were known more for what they were against, all these breaking of the laws,
mm,
than what they were for, which was the
mm.
peace and holiness, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And we can fall into that trap now where
Mm, mm.
we're against all these things and we're more
Yeah.
vocal about the things we're against
Mhm.
than what we're for.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely, definitely. Yeah, yeah. I I, th- I think you're absolutely right, and I think the the sad thing obviously is that actually with the way that God breaks into the world through Jesus, and the work that God continues to do in the world through the continual action of the Holy Spirit, building the kingdom of God even in our midst, is actually meant to rewrite. So culturally, it will always look like there's things that we cannot do, but those things that people think are a choice of can or cannot are about this sense of personal autonomy in a, particularly for us, in a Western context, which tells us these are the most important things about who you are and how you live in the world, and what it means to be happy and successful. And yet kingdom is about something that's so different than what our cultures are structured and established at. And so they do, by their very nature, sit in these places where we are asked to, not, but it's not that we can't do something. It's that we're choosing not to do something because that's a lesser form of living. And actually there's, and I think like that's the thing, Jesus says, called us to live life and to live it in all of its abundance. And I know for myself that those times where I pick and choose things for myself, for my autonomy, for my position, my power, my preferences, so often than not, if they become ends in themselves and they're never satisfying. And those times where actually I'm able to put myself aside and share some fellowship with somebody, and learn about them and have them kind of teach me, or we share food, or like you and I often sharing a laugh, and those things are actually, culture has seems to have no kind of appreciation for them, and yet those bring me life in a way that nothing else does. And I think, yeah, so someone might say, what can what can't you do? And it's like, well, I choose not to do a lot of things because I know that they're not the best for me. And I want to live a fuller life. I
Mm,
want that fulfillment, as Jesus was saying about the fulfillment of the law and the prophets that call us into a fullness of a kingdom, which is the presence of God with God's people, serving and loving, and seeing the world redeemed and restored and healed. And yeah, I want more of that, and I don't want to be ashamed of it, and I don't want people to feel feel like it's just, as you say, like a Bible bashing guilt trip, because
yeah.
that's not going to get us anywhere either, right?
Yeah, when I had the conversation, I mentioned to the guy, I'm like, I don't really think of myself like what I'm against. I think of myself what I'm for: love, peace, justice,
Mm,
mercy. I think God's
mm,
doing those things, and I'm trying to
mhm,
follow His way. And He's like, "Oh, okay, I get that." And then it started like a 2 week conversation that just kept rolling, and it kept rolling, and
mm,
just different questions, and sometimes asking some really difficult ones, and sometimes asking some
mm,
questions that is God so strong he can make a stone that he can't lift? And I'm like, that's a dumb question. Like, who cares? Like, things like that. Like let's talk about real things. And
Yeah.
when you were talking about the fullness and the conversations there, the one where that kept popping into my mind was diversity, right? Like that's
Mm.
to
Mm.
experience life the fullest is to get all these experiences and to interact with people. And if we just make people conform to what we see as a church, then we're missing out on that
Mm.
diversity and the fullness of even our faith
Yeah.
and where we can go.
Mhm.
It's amazing that we're like, oh God, you're such a wonderful creator. You've made all these different types of trees and all these different types of animals and all these different types of these, and you're so
Yeah.
imaginative and so creative. But if you could make humans fit in this box and be
Yeah.
just like me and have my same ideas and my same sense of humor and my same passions for things and sense of morality and justice and that if you could have that, that would be
Mm.
awesome. Or at
No, no,
least
there's a
or at
yeah.
least give them a mind that I can change, right? Enough that they be like mine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right?
And
And
I think, I think it's just that's truth, Derek. But yeah, I would just say
Love
I
it.
think the end at the end of the day, what are we for?
Exactly.
And what is God calling us to, as you where is God calling us with our bleach bottles? Not
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
not to
Not
make
the
things white, but but to make that we can be clean and holy. Yeah.
and just for anyone wondering, the calling from the wilderness does not condone drinking bleach or anything like that to get rid of the coronavirus. I just want to make that clear. That we are not.
It's
When Tim
very
was saying
important.
take your bleach bottles, that is not what he meant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And we are not we are not being paid by Big Bleach. So but if they'd like to sponsor this
bleach.
podcast,
Yeah. What was it
um
like that Ajax bottle? Because Ajax was that Roman god or the Greek god or whatever, and it was like stronger than Greece because he was the strongest in Greece. And it's like a joke that's been like 200 years in the making, and no one picked up on it until someone did. It's kind of funny.
amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Anyway,
Excellent.
went deep.
That's
We went like this with that deep
yeah, and then
deep
we
wells.
definitely flew well out of the shallow in that in the end. So it's
Yeah,
probably a
and I
good
don't
time to
think we
wrap it
answered
up.
one of the questions we had, but that's all right. That's what this
So we
podcast
got
is.
next week. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's what next week is for. Yeah,
Yes.
so next week we will be looking at um, the different conversations we had, the
Mhm.
Beatitude, the Salt and Light, and today.
Mhm.
And so join us. Once again, remember, ask questions or discussion. Like, oh, I
Yeah.
never thought about holiness like that. Or, you kind of
Mm.
left things out. Like, what about people who struggle with things and shouldn't go to places like that because they might be tempted in that? Like, let's
Yeah.
start a discussion there.
Absolutely.
And next week we'll find out who Tim is and ask him some questions as
I've,
well.
I'm- I've I've got a week to figure it out, so
Yeah.
I'm up for it. uh,
All
bless
right.
you, man.
Blessings. Blessings to you all.
Take
Have
care.
peace.